therefore, refrain from concluding of any particular instance of horrific suffering we know of that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit that. Notice how things are different when it comes to thinking about brains and vats. Both theists and non-theists can agree that it's perfectly reasonable to think you know as a matter of common sense that you have hands, and also that you aren't a handless brain in a vat. It is perhaps not clear how you know you aren't a handless brain in a vat, but it's nevertheless reasonable to think that you know it, even if you think ST1 through ST4 are true. But things are different with P3. It's not reasonable to think you can just see as a matter of common sense that P3 is true. Both theists and non-theists can reasonably agree with ST1 through ST4, and also with P1 and P2. And given those, given ST1 through 4, and given P1 and P2, both theists and non-theists should agree that we just don't seem able to reasonably believe P3, either directly or via an OCM inference. How then do I explain the temptation to think of some particularly horrific evil, that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit that? I think it's not uncommon to be tempted to think this, and that something about this thought seems sensible and morally right, even obligatory. I'll try here to explain why I think we feel tempted to think this, despite the fact that it's a mistake. To this point, I haven't given actual examples of horrific suffering. The worst examples, and the ones that most tempt us to think a loving God wouldn't permit them, are too painful to consider in vivid detail. But consider the abduction, enslavement, mutilation, and repeated raping of a young Sudanese teenage girl named Eluel Mengon Deng over a period of several years by Sudanese government soldiers. Even if we only read about this in the newspaper and ponder it, it is hard to take. How much worse if we know the person, if she is a dear loved one, and we know of these events or even see them happening, but are powerless to help. The suffering of the victim seems beyond comprehension. But even the distress one of us would feel if we knew that our beloved wife or daughter or sister or mother were going through this also seems to be too much to imagine or bear. When a consideration of this sort of horrendous evil becomes particularly real or vivid, as it does on occasion, a natural reaction is a feeling of being overwhelmed by the horror of it and of being filled with hatred for the evil acts and often for the perpetrators of them. This is accompanied by an incredibly strong conviction that deep hatred for these evil actions is the only possible response for any person with even a minimal level of moral decency. And this leads to a strong inclination to think that anyone, including God, who knows of such evil acts and could prevent them but doesn't, is failing morally by failing to hate these acts with the appropriate intensity. This is the sort of thing that I suspect is often behind the thought that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit that. At least this is what seems to be going on in my own mind when I find myself tempted by that thought. But although I wholeheartedly approve of and share the empathy for the victim, the extreme hatred of the cruelty, and the belief that there is something extremely morally wrong with a person who knows of such evils, but doesn't hate them to the point of being very strongly motivated to prevent them, I think that it's a mistake to think we can see that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit these instances of horrific suffering. The problem is that we have no good reason to deny that our perspective, when we contemplate these horrors, might be very different from the perspective of a perfectly loving God, even though both we and God hate such suffering intensely and are strongly motivated to prevent it. Moreover, we have no good reason to deny that if we were able to have God's perspective on the horrific suffering in question, we might wholeheartedly approve of his permission of it. Let me explain why I say these things. In a case where a parent allows her cancer-ridden child to suffer the miseries of risky tumor removal surgery, radiation therapy, and chemotherapy, we think it's morally permissible to do so because of the good that the parent can achieve only by permitting that suffering. We have a grasp of both evils, the evil of the treatment-induced suffering and the evil of early death by cancer. And we think that although the former is a bad thing, permitting it is morally justified if it's necessary in order to avoid the latter. But in the case of the horrific suffering we see around us, we have no grasp of any worse evil that we think cannot be avoided without permitting that sort of horrific suffering. And likewise, we have no grasp of any greater outweighing good that we think cannot be achieved except by permitting such suffering. It's natural for humans to be much more motivated to prevent some horrific suffering presented to them in a vivid fashion than they are to avoid some possible event with no details imagined except the bare stipulation that it's worse than E. When we contemplate and are overwhelmed by some actual horrific evil E that we know of, the only evil we have before our minds is that evil E. Given that, it's no wonder we can't find the least bit of sympathy for permitting it. Without having vividly before our minds something we hate even more, something we think can be avoided only by permitting E, it's not easy to empathize with the decision to permit E. However, if we were able to hold vividly before our minds both the horrific suffering E that we see and a much worse, far more hated evil, one we think we can avoid only by permitting E, I think we would feel about the permission of the horrific suffering E that we see just as we do about the permission of cancer treatment. But it's not just that we haven't got any clear picture of a worse alternative before our minds, one we think can be avoided only by permitting some horrific suffering like E. It's also that in contemplating E, we may be nearing the limit of our ability to take in horrific suffering. It's plausible that even if there are evils much worse than E, our psychologies make us incapable of fully taking in the horror of them. A highly sensitive and sheltered child might be unable to imagine horrors worse than tumor removal surgery. Even thinking about such surgery might be almost more than the child can bear. Taking in a vivid portrayal of such suffering might be at the upper limit of her ability to comprehend suffering, so that being vividly exposed to any worse horrors would just feel like more of the same to her and leave her equally shocked and emotionally overwhelmed. But normal adults can take in and understand horrors much worse than such surgery. In the same way, God, if God exists, would be able to take in and understand horrors far worse than the ones that feel overwhelming to us. Perhaps on some objective scale of badness, the horrors of cancer treatment are at level 10, and the horrors of the long-term enslavement and raping of Sudanese girls and of the Nazi treatment of Jews in the Holocaust are between 85 and 100. And perhaps the ability of humans to take in such suffering and accurately assess its badness tops out when the horrors reach the 100 or 200 or 500 level. Perhaps being exposed to vivid portrayals of things that are objectively more horrifying than that causes us to be overwhelmed and to begin to shut down emotionally and cognitively. Even so, things would be otherwise with God. God, if he exists, would be able to take in and accurately evaluate horrors at a level of 1 million and beyond, horrors we can't imagine and are not capable psychologically of taking in. And if God were to permit some evil on the level of 100 or 500, because he knew that that was the only way to prevent some evil on the level of 1 million, no morally decent person would object to that, any more than they would object to a parent's choice to let her child undergo painful treatment for cancer. My theory of error then is this. Sometimes, when we are exposed to a vivid portrayal of some actual instance of horrific suffering E, we are tempted to think that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit E. I think it's a mistake to think that we can see that this is true or even likely. The reason we make this mistake is, first, that we have only that evil E vividly before our minds, with no worse evil, seen to be avoidable only by permitting E, grasped in any detail at all. The vivid image persuades and motivates. The mere possibility of a worse evil, without any details added, can't compete in terms of arousing our sympathetic appreciation of a choice to avoid it. Second, in grasping E vividly, we are already nearing the limits of the amount of horror we are able to take in, which tempts us to think that nothing could be more hateful than E is. But our inability to take in greater horrors is not a good indication of how bad horrors can be. Notice that on this theory of error, it's not the case that we hate the horrific suffering we see more than it should be hated. Perhaps we see only part of its hatefulness and don't hate it as much as it deserves to be hated. Maybe we aren't even capable of that. Nor is it the case on this theory of error that God doesn't care about the horrific suffering we see and hate. God, if he exists, hates it as it deserves to be hated, which might be far more than we are capable of